Hi, my name is Ruby Collins, and today I'll be presenting my research titled, I feel like if so long put on a face of I'm okay, that in itself is how people see me, making visible identity negotiation among chronically ill femmes. This research was conducted under the mentorship of Dr. Pamela McMullen-Messier of the Sociology Department. So a prominent concept within sociological research is that of identity expectations. You might have heard of gender expectations before, and this research pulls from similar understandings. We understand that certain social and physical contexts, such as relationships or the workplace, produce specific identity expectations, and that individuals both consciously and unconsciously employ strategies of identity negotiation to navigate those expectations. In this study, I specifically call upon two existing frameworks of identity negotiation: disclosure and performativity. So, disclosure encompasses all the ways that people explicitly tell others about their identities, while performativity includes how individuals socially perform and then physically present their identities. Some background: we also need to know who chronically ill femmes are. So, chronically ill femmes' identity is situated at the intersection of queerness and disability. Femme identity is a subset of queer identity that's centered around a queer femininity and transgressing feminine norms. This is a modern label that derives from femme lesbian identity of the 1950s. However, modernly we understand that anyone of any gender can identify as femme. We also look at chronically ill identity, which is a subset of disabled identity, and describes the experience of people who have prolonged or lifelong illness. So the primary question that this research sought to answer was, how do chronically ill femmes negotiate identity expectations? Specifically, what strategies do they employ, and how do strategies vary among identities or experiences? Additionally, I wanted to know, how do identity expectations intersect for this population? What expectations were present, where, and from whom? So this work engaged with the specific tradition of qualitative sociology that's called grounded theory. So in grounded theory, we seek to construct a theory from participant data rather than applying a theory to participant data. With that framework in mind, the stated goal of this research is to tie together frameworks of disclosure, performativity, and identity expectations to create a preliminary framework to situate chronically ill femmes' engagement with identity negotiation strategies. So sampling for the study was conducted in an open online support group that had 700 plus members at the time of recruitment. I made multiple posts for recruitment in different topic channels, and additionally, group members were encouraged to share the information about the study with their social networks. So that's a practice called snowball sampling. This whole process resulted in 12 contacts, 4 of whom ended up participating. Each participant then underwent a hour-long to an hour and a half long semi-structured interview over Zoom. Each interview was transcribed, and then I input them into Deduce, where I began inductive coding. So in line with the principles of grounded theory, codes were derived from the interviews rather than having predetermined codes that the interviews sought to fill. Then once I had the preliminary themes, I engaged in a strategy called memoing to further develop them and explore the relationships between them. So moving into my findings, I'm going to start with my secondary questions. So what expectations were present? Expectations of disability and femininity in the interviews largely aligned with the literature on expectations. However, the expectations participants reflected mostly centered dominant perspective. So, for example, instead of focusing on expectations of femme identity within queer communities, participants reflected experiencing expectations about dominant femininity more broadly. What context did expectations come from? So participants couldn't always identify where expectations came from. However, participants did identify that they felt some expectations were internalized. One participant said, "A lot of it isn't explicit. Like there's not ever like cross your legs like a lady, but I do feel there are expectations." So how did identity expectations intersect for this population? First, I do want to note that there were many complex intersections, and with 4 participants, these were at times difficult to fully interrogate. However, multiple participants did discuss intersections of femininity and queerness, stating that they felt they had to present in a certain way that aligned with expectations about their gender, identity, or sexuality. Additionally, participants identified moments where expectations of femininity had implications for their presentations of illness. So sentiments such as "that's our own private thing" that we go through individually conveyed that it was not feminine and outside the expectations to be ill in public. Next, I identified specific strategies of identity negotiation that chronically ill femmes employed in response to those expectations. So for performativity, participants reflected changing their dress, changing their disability aid use, and changing how they displayed their symptoms based on expectations. Participants reflected modifying their physical presentation to match how they were feeling and in order to ensure that others would believe them and to curb assumptions that they were faking their illness. Similarly, participants also modified their disability aid choices to align with how they thought others would perceive them, either as abled or disabled, and they changed their disability aid use based on this rather than strictly because of their needs. In a similar vein, participants also reflected feeling that it was expected that they would not be sick in public, and they would often engage in efforts to mask their symptoms. And then in terms of disclosure, participants engaged in selective disclosure, which is disclosure on a spectrum where physical and social context mediate what a person chooses to disclose. So this type of disclosure is heavily detailed in the literature and was present among my participants. However, participants' experiences also suggested that there was another way that they engaged in disclosure, and I titled these disclosures needs-based disclosures. So needs-based disclosures were disclosures that were motivated by unmet medical or access needs. So for example, a participant reflected, "Yeah, I obviously, if it's like an urgent situation, I will disclose. And if someone doesn't know about my chronic illness, I'll explain what's happening in the moment and tell them I will give you more context now, but this is what I need right now." So this motivation for disclosure was not present in the literature on queer disclosure or detailed in the literature on disability identity. Samuels 2002 cautions against directly transposing queer identity frameworks onto disability identity. And as much current research draws from queer identity frameworks, I find it important to note this motivation for disclosure and that this could be a unique strategy to disability. I also identified 2 other patterns in participants' use of disclosure. The first being solidarity disclosure, which is when people disclose their identities to others who have disclosed shared identities to them. So this disclosure is detailed in a study of queer disabled college students by Miller and colleagues. And among the participants in my study, all of them shared that they were more likely to disclose to someone they knew held marginalized identities, and several noted that they were more likely to disclose to other disabled people and other people of marginalized genders. A participant also noted that they wouldn't disclose to an acquaintance in the presence of a friend in an effort to not embarrass the person they were associated with if their disclosure wasn't received well. Some participants also noted that they would intentionally structure their disclosures to not use the word disabled. So in addition to my findings, I also learned many valuable lessons from this research that could be applicable to future studies of a similar kind. First, the study had a very limited number of participants. I do want to clarify that this study does not seek to be generalizable to all in the population, but rather to highlight points of future inquiry and build a framework for identity negotiation among this population. I do still find it important to reflect on why there might have been low participation. So to begin, there was a very limited period of recruitment for the study. Recruitment took place from late June to late August. Additionally, I think the method of data collection interviews required a high level of energy and engagement from participants. So in their 2022 study of experiences of chronic illness, Guattari and Beltran engage in multiple forms of data collection, such as interviews, self-recordings, photos, and written responses. which offer greater accessibility of involvement to their participants, and future studies might want to engage with data collection in this very way. Another potential reason for low recruitment might have been community connotations surrounding the label femme. So as I mentioned earlier, femme derives from the lesbian community. It was initially associated with white cisgender lesbians. So although the label has really lost its connotation and it was defined in recruitment materials, some in the community might have discounted their qualification in the study because of this history. There's also been some discourse in the community surrounding co-optation of the label by cisgender heterosexual white women, and my positionality as a white cisgendered queer person might have made participants wary of this. Another limitation of the study was that participants had limited racial diversity. Participants also had a limited age range between 20 and 30 years old, and an education level that might have been higher than the population of the online community. And so one possible reason I believe that the age range and the education levels, we might have seen those patterns, is because participants had a familiarity and positive association with research. So the conclusion of our interviews, 2 participants shared with me that they wanted to participate because they had conducted research themselves in the past. And so that might explain those discrepancies. Additionally, I noticed in the first portion of interviews, most of that time was spent equating participants to the terminology used academically to talk about disabled and queer identity. And participants had awareness of these experiences that the terms describe, but not the terms themselves. And there aren't colloquial alternatives to all of these terms. And so a suggestion that I have is that future research conducts a series of interviews with participants, or whatever involvement type, to offer the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the terms, as well as to offer a chance for deeper reflection over time. Finally, I suggest that future research inquire into the needs-based disclosure. And I think of interest are the questions, is needs-based disclosure unique to disability identity? And is needs-based disclosure truly distinct from selective disclosure? I want to thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, you can use the comment feature. I can also be reached at ruby.collins@cwu.edu. I want to thank the McNair Program, the William O. Douglas Honors College, and my mentor, Dr. Pamela McMullen-Messier. And then here's my first references slide and my second references slide. Thank you.